Hey everyone, welcome to the video. If you're new to the channel, my name is Solomon Thomas. I just received my master's in general psychology and I have the goal of becoming a clinical psychologist one day. So I'm making these YouTube videos for a few reasons. One, I'm trying to practice speaking about some of the ideas that I'm thinking and writing about so I can clarify them and hopefully get any feedback from anyone out there who's listening. But two, I think the ideas that I'm researching could be helpful again to anyone out there who comes across these videos. And so in this video, I wanted to discuss ideology. Really, I'll be continuing my investigation into ideological structures, what they are, how people can be possessed by them. And in this video, I want to focus on how to protect yourself against ideological possession. So first, let's define some terms. What is an ideology? I would say that an ideology is a corrupted belief system. Now, it's a belief system because human beings don't deal with reality directly. What we do is we see the world through our memories, through our knowledge structures, which we've generated in part from our past experience, and some of which we've generated just as a product of our biological evolution, and some of which also comes from our exposure to different sociological interactions. So we see the world through a set of knowledge structures. It's not necessarily the case that we deal with the world directly. And your set of knowledge structures that helps you navigate your environment is, in one sense, a belief system. You could also think of it as the map that you use to navigate the territory. When you deal with objects, when you deal with people, when you are perceiving the world, you're dealing more so with a map and not the territory. Now, why do I say that an ideology is a corrupted belief system, or why do I say that it's a faulty map? I characterize an ideology in a few ways. One, it's rigid. Two, it's simple. Three, it cannot be questioned, and this is an inherent part of the ideology. It's not necessarily something that comes about as humans adopt the ideology, although I think that could also be a case. I think that there's something fundamental about the nature of ideologies that you can't question them. And a caveat on that as well is that oftentimes ideologies require force to be adopted throughout a society. And then the final feature of an ideology is that, generally speaking, it does not mesh with reality, and therefore it's maladaptive across most circumstances and contexts. An example of an ideology that I'm using right now is political correctness. And so the idea of political correctness originated in the Soviet Union, or a little bit before the Soviet Union, with Lenin. And the idea was that there is a way of looking at the world that a few people decided was correct, and these few people so happen to be in power as well. And in order for this view of the world to maintain itself, it couldn't be questioned. And so to be politically correct was to sacrifice your pursuit of objective truth or absolute truth, to the degree that human beings can attain either of those things, for the pursuit of this correct way of viewing the world. And one manifestation of political correctness today would be in the trans ideology pronoun discussion. Perhaps we'll return to that. So that's what an ideology is. I believe that it's a corrupted belief system. It is a belief system in that it's a way to navigate the world, and it's a map, and in a small minority of cases it might even have some adaptive truth to it, and some validity. But generally speaking, as more and more people adopt the ideology, and as individuals use it to try to overcome various obstacles in their physical and social environments, it fails. Other examples of ideologies, and this comes from the work of Gad Saad and his book, The Parasitic Mind. Other examples include moral relativism, critical race theory, particularly third and fourth wave feminism, gender ideology, transgender ideology. We already spoke of these, but these are some of the ideas and networks of ideas that are in our current culture, and many of them have common sources, but we won't get into those right now. Now, what does it mean for an individual to be possessed by an ideology? So let's talk about possession for a little bit. As I was thinking about the idea of possession, I thought about the book The Discovery of the Unconscious by Henri Ellenberger, and that book is a history of science, I would say. It's a history of science, it's a history of psychology and depth psychology, and it's also specifically a history of psychoanalysis, and so Freud's school specifically. One of Ellenberger's starting points is with The Exorcist in the 1700s, late 1700s, I believe. And the exorcists were individuals who were able to slash claimed to cure people of various illnesses slash demonic possessions. And so the idea that an individual could be possessed is something that's been with us for at least hundreds of years. Of course, the exorcists thought that demons were possessing people, but I think that they were correct in their explicit idea of you not necessarily always being in control of your perceptions and actions, but also they were implicitly correct, in my opinion, in the assertion that you have a soul in your body, but there's room for something else that can push your soul aside and then take over your body. And then if we translate that directly into psychoanalysis, we can imagine the idea of you having an ego, which is like you. That's you with your thoughts. That's what people typically think about when they are thinking of themselves. But then you have these other components of your embodied psyche, such as your superego, which you could think of as your internalized representation of social norms and morality of your culture. And then you have your id, which is your network of motivations and unconscious memories and drives. Freud focused primarily on sexual and aggressive drives. And if you had a weak ego, if you have a pathologized ego, your superego or various psychological phenomena from your id could take over your ego. And so you could be possessed by your lust, you could be possessed by your overbearing superego, or you could be possessed by your anger, your rage, and your aggression. And so this idea of possession is something that I think is apt and has plenty of grounding in psychological literature and the history of science and the history of religion, for that matter, as well. So let's combine possession with ideological possession. I think it occurs primarily linguistically, but I could be wrong about that. As we make our way through society, as we're growing up from adolescence into young adulthood, and then we start either go to college or we start working and we try to make friends and become socialized, often what happens is that we try to adopt certain social norms. And in some circles, those norms include ways of speaking and ways of perceiving and ways of acting. And particularly when it comes to the ways of speaking, language can impact how we think as well, particularly as you practice saying the same thing over and over again. And so to be possessed by an ideology, I think could be reasonably thought of as being possessed by a set of conceptual ideas that we receive from the social environment. So going back to political correctness, I started volunteering at the VA and we had to go through this equal opportunity seminar training. That's a more appropriate word. And a big part of the training was to make sure that we act politically correct, and that term was explicitly used when we are in the workplace. And so one of the older gentlemen there brought up a scenario where he was at work at the VA and he was trying to let these two ladies into an elevator. And so he held the elevator door and he said, ladies first. And although everything's anonymous, he then got reported shortly after because of that remark. Now, this is just his side of the story. There's so many other things that potentially could be at play. But that was just one story that made me think, wow, we are really on edge. Like, and everyone else or many other people at the training also expressed that perspective that we all feel from our different cultures and different ages and different backgrounds, we feel like we're walking on eggshells because to be politically correct is to conform to this one way of thinking, but we don't exactly understand the one way of thinking because to be politically incorrect is subjectively defined. And this is something that the instructor explicitly said. Anything could be taken as offensive. And so it's better to not say anything, essentially, or it's better to just try your best to do your work. But many people express this tension and they express this view that our culture and our society is becoming soft and sensitive. But the instructor, just while she acknowledged and listened very well, I would say, she pushed back, and this is her job, of course, to just say that, look, I don't remember the quote exactly, but she said something along the lines of civil case is predicated on feelings because offense or the capacity to be offended and what is determined to be actually offensive is subjective. The intention behind people's words, behind people's actions no longer matter, at least according to the federal government, to the degree that this training was espousing the assertions of the federal government. So this instructor, we can focus on her. She was an example of being ideologically possessed. She was saying these things and she was going off these trainings, and I don't know her very well. I don't know her unconscious. I don't know what she was consciously thinking, but at least from what I could gather, she would say things like, look, I understand that in your culture, saying X might be funny and it might be okay and everyone does this, but here at work, you have to leave that at the door and you have to be politically correct. She will say those words that you have to be politically correct, but she may or may not understand that what she's also asserting is this idea that truth, as far as the truth of what's offensive and what's not, what is not offensive, is something that's subjectively defined. And what's implied by that is that truth is also subjectively defined. And she also put forth this idea that we want diversity and we want to promote differences of opinions, but at the same time, you have to be politically correct in the way that you say these things. And so not really, we don't want your diverse backgrounds and things of that nature. And so to be ideologically possessed, at least in this context, was it looked something like knowing what is true, yet deliberately lying for some other purpose. It's some subversion of your moral hierarchy where truth becomes subordinate to something else. And I think in this case, it's something like compassion. It's something like we don't want to offend other people. It's something like we want to make sure that everyone is safe. So that's ideology, that's possession. How do you avoid being ideologically possessed? Now, I'll say up front, I'm not sure if anyone can avoid it. I think at some point in our lives, we will all be possessed by one corrupted belief system or another. I know I've been. So while I talk about how to avoid it, I'm perhaps also talking about how to identify it and how to protect yourself and perhaps how to reduce the amount of damage that gets done. So I think the first step is to realize that you are not a unitary being psychologically. I think that's something that's helpful to know. You are a multiplicity of different motivations, drives, emotions, subpersonalities. You were everything from your birth order to how your mother raised you, your relationship with your father. There are all these different forces that create who you are. And ideally, we would like to be integrated. We would like to have all of those different sub personalities and components integrated into a whole that is adaptive and that is capable of deriving meaning from the suffering that's in the world. But we're all in different parts of that journey. So it's important to first recognize that you aren't the master in your own home, is a phrase that I've heard a lot. Now, I would say a second step in protecting yourself from ideological possession is to have this devotion to telling the truth, or at least not lying. And that's a rule that Jordan Peterson has in his book, 12 Rules for Life. The truth is something that's very difficult. Capital T truth is not easy to define, and it requires way more wisdom than I have. Let's just say that. But the other part of the rule, tell the truth or at least don't lie, that's something that's very helpful because many of us know when we are lying. It's important to not lie for many reasons, but for our current conversation, because that predisposes you for these pathological ideas and ideologies. Remember earlier in the conversation, I mentioned that one of the ways I characterize an ideology is as something that does not stand the test against reality, or at least I hope I said that. It's not truthful. It's maladaptive. It's a corrupted map that maybe works in a small subset of scenarios, but it doesn't generalize across circumstances and contexts. And so as you're navigating your world and as you're fine-tuning your map and your knowledge structures, you want to be open to reality objecting to you and correcting you. And that's how you become better. That's how you become smarter, wiser, stronger. It's voluntarily putting yourself in a scenario where there are opportunities to learn and there are opportunities to fail, because those are essentially the same thing. But if you lie to yourself and close yourself off from reality and run away from the truth, then there's never going to be a way for you to update your map and to check and see if you are ideologically possessed. Because to the degree, in my opinion, that you are not ideologically possessed, your knowledge structures should help you better navigate your life. And I think I'm going to end it there with just those two things, because I think that's good enough and I've been talking for a long time. But if you want to protect yourself against ideological possession, first understand that you have many forces that are vying for your limited attentional resources in your mind, in your psyche. And we've all seen this. We know when someone's extremely angry or afraid, or if they're drunk, like we know this idea that people aren't acting themselves. And so I believe we have this deep phenomenological experience of people being more or less themselves, but also being capable of deviating so far off the path that we notice that, okay, that's not them. There's something else that's driving their behaviors. And that's the same thing with you. It's the same thing with all of us. It's important to recognize that we have this ability to have our self, capital S self, our integrated personality dissolve. And when it dissolves, we're weak. When all these different multiplicity of factors and motivations and drives are fighting with each other, we're weak. So know that you have a multiplicity and try to integrate them. And that's something that perhaps we can talk about in another video. And then the second thing that I would leave you guys with is, again, a rule from Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Yeah, gonna end it there. All right. Thank you guys for listening. See you in the next video.